So we want to introduce our next speaker is Robert L. Emerson, and he is the Executive Director of Old Fort Niagara. Mr. Emerson has served as the Executive Director of the Old Fort Niagara since 1997. Prior to that, he served 13 years with the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission as their site administrator. During his tenure at Old Fort Niagara, he has expanded the site's interpretive facilities, developed new programming, and expanded financial support for capital and operational projects. Bob's main interest and focus is on the French occupation of Fort Niagara between 1726 and 1759. He was a member of the 250th anniversary commemoration committee for the French and Indian War. And you've always heard a little bit more, so now we're going to hear a little bit more from Bob. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Today we're going to talk about another chapter that doesn't receive much attention, and that's the time between the fall of Fort Duquesne and the siege of Fort Niagara. So, we're going to start with the fall of Fort Duquesne. Everyone knows that the struggle between the English and the French for control of Western Pennsylvania ended on November 25th, 1758, with the British occupation of the forks of the Ohio, right? Isn't that right? Well, this would have been news to Captain Thomas Bullitt, whose supply convoy was attacked on May 23rd, 1759 by French and Indian raiders within 4 miles of Fort Ligonier. The truth was that the French were very much still an active threat to the British in western Pennsylvania throughout the first half of 1759. The French had evacuated and destroyed Fort Duquesne between November 19th and November 24th, 1758. The fort's commandant, 55-year-old Captain François-Marie Le Marchand de Linares, sent his artillery and munitions down the Ohio, probably to Fort Massiat, where Metropolis, Illinois, is today. This fort had been actually built the year before in 1757 as a bulwark against the day that the British would take Fort Duquesne. So, the rest of his force, about 192 men, he moves up what we will call it the Allegheny River. The French called it La Belle Rivière, considered it part of the Ohio. We're going to talk about it as the Allegheny today, just to be clear. He and 192 men withdraw up the Allegheny to Fort de Michaux, Franklin, Pennsylvania. He reached that post on November 28th, and he kept about 100 men at Fort Michaux. Now, de Linares is an interesting guy. Like many French officers, he entered the service very early in life. He had a long and distinguished career. He served under his father at Western outposts, enlisting as a cadet at age 14. In his 20s, he served against the Foxes in Wisconsin, and he got a good look at the Ohio Valley when he accompanied Baron Langeais on his expedition in 1739 against the Chickasaw native nation. He was active in the War of Austrian Secession in the 1740s. He was second in command of a raid on Annapolis Royal under Paul Marin de Malgueux, who later is the guy who builds the portage from Erie down to LeBoeuf. He participates in several raids in Acadia, and he distinguished himself at the Battle of the Monongahela in July of 1755, from which he was awarded the Croix de Saint-Louis. So he saw a lot of combat. He has a lot of experience with Native American people, and he successfully defended Fort Duquesne against Major Jamie Grant's abortive reconnaissance in September of 1758. We always call that engagement grants defeat, I'm going to suggest it's Leary's victory. So let's turn the tables around a little bit. Fort Michaux was not a strong position. According to the governor of New France, Governor Vaudreuil, and I quote, "The Michaux post is only a supply post. At most, it can only be put in shape to resist musketry fire. It is too weak to be able to sustain a siege. Cannon would quickly demolish it. It is, moreover, so poorly located that from the top of the mountains, which are very near, everything happening inside can be seen." Later spy reports indicated that the fort was armed with only one swivel gun, and it was strategically pointed downriver. So, not a strong position. The same spy reported that soldiers were busy repairing the fort's curtain wall and had removed one of the curtain walls and were in the process of digging the ditch necessary to replace the stockades. So, in the winter of 1758-59, Fort Michaux, not even all of the walls are standing because they're trying to put it in some kind of shape for defense. It's a very, very weak position. Vaudreuil had ordered Leary to make the fort safe from surprise attack as his first priority. He was given instructions only to abandon the fort, however, if a large enemy force with artillery approached. So here are Linares' orders. He's at Fort Michaux. First of all, as I mentioned, making the fort safe from attack and preventing an English advance toward Lake Erie. That was number one priority. A second mission that he was to accomplish was to interrupt communications to the enemy by sending out large raiding parties. He's to inflict damage and confusion and discover enemy operations and plans. His third objective, force the English to mount an additional campaign in western Pennsylvania. And fourthly and lastly, to support Native American nations and regain their goodwill. Against this, at Pittsburgh, the Forbes expedition, before leaving, they leave Pennsylvania Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Mercer, in command, and he is given instructions to build a small temporary fort near the forks of the Ohio. And this he does. It's commonly referred to as Mercer's Fort today. They just referred to it as Pittsburgh then. And if you can look there on the Monongahela River bank, it's upriver from Fort Duquesne and a little bit upriver from where the future Fort Pitt would be located. This fort was built during December and January of 1758-59, but it was really not finished until July of 1759. So this is Hugh Mercer. He is a very good leader. He's an aggressive leader. He later goes on to die at the Battle of Princeton during the American Revolution. He has about 200 Pennsylvania and Virginia provincials under his command at Fort Mercer, at Mercer's Fort at Pittsburgh. Now, here we have a little map that shows Michaux and Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh. You've got two posts about 80 miles apart as the crow flies. You've got weak garrisons in both, and you have both posts that are out at the end of very, very long supply lines. So we're going to have a very active winter and spring between these two outposts. Obviously, if Leary has 100 men or so, and Mercer has 200 men or so, where's the balance of power going to lie? Well, it's with native nations. And here in the upper Ohio Valley, the native nations are very weary of war. In 1758, they've been promised some things by the English. They're beginning to defect from the French, at least listening to what the English have to say. but many are just waiting to see what happens. And if the opportunity exists to play one side against the other, let's take advantage of that situation. As I said, the British had made diplomatic efforts. In 1758, Colonel Bouquet conducts a big council with Native nations at Pittsburgh in December before he leaves to go back east. And quite a few have come to be around around Pittsburgh, come to stay there and get presents from the English and help out with the English war effort at this point. On the French side, Governor Vaudreuil advises Leary to do all he can to win back the goodwill, and I love the way of those who may have cooled to us. So the French are making efforts as well to cultivate these native nations. It's interesting that when Fort Duquesne was abandoned, there were very, very few trade goods left there in store, but there were some. And so Leary sends those trade goods to Conshohocken, Ohio. There was a native village there. That's where the trade goods from Fort Duquesne were sent to try to keep those natives friendly to the French. He appointed, quote, a person worthy of trust to distribute the goods and to induce them always to take our side and attack the English. Leary posted, and I have to read this because these names are incredibly long. He posted Lieutenant Pierre-Louis Boucher de Niverville de Montezembert. Yeah, his checking account must have been fun. He posted this officer at a cluster of villages known as the Kuskies on the Beaver River, around where Newcastle, Pennsylvania is today, to hang out with the native population there, Delaware, Shawnee, some Mingos, try to retain French influence in these settlements. Others were posted at a place called the Salt Springs, about 35 miles further west of Kuskuski on the Mahoning River, possibly where Niles, Ohio is today. So the French are keeping their agents in among these native villages. It was said that at Salt Springs, the French soldiers lived, quote, in small cabins, have no store of arms and but little provision. Their design seems to be to preserve some interest among the Indians, as they have been very liberal in their presents to the great men, particularly Delaware George. One thing that's interesting as we go through this, most of what we know about these French dispositions over the winter are coming from Native American spies who are working their way to Fort Michaux, working their way to the Kuskies or to Salt Springs, and spying on the French efforts, and then bringing back word to Mercer at Pittsburgh. And one of the consistent messages that's being brought back is how many trade goods the French are offering. And at this time, some of the people in Quebec are eating horse meat because there's not enough food to go around. It's pretty hard to believe that there would be this large supply of trade goods available out here in the Ohio Valley. Hard to say. Another activity that was going on at this time was intelligence gathering. Both sides were trying to find out what the other was up to. And in this case, they were mostly using Native American spies to spy on the enemy camp. The French kept spies near Mercer's fort. In March, Vaudreuil reported that Monsieur de Leary has not stopped sending French and savage scouts out to scout the English. Mercer at Pittsburgh reported that 2 officers and some Indians from Venango have hovered about us for some days, but carefully avoid all the traps we can lay for them. There is no coming up with them, but by a fox hunt to Venango, where we may possibly catch old Linares in his hole. little bit of a sense of humor there. All right. Mercer also received reports on the French position at Fort Michaux, dispatching numerous native spies in that direction. One report said the garrison consists of about 100 men commanded by 7 officers, all formerly stationed at Duquesne, the soldiers employed in repairing the fort. It is square with 4 bastions. In February, another native told Mercer that, quote, a French officer told him that 1,000 soldiers and a number of long-haired Indians were on their march across the lake from Niagara, that their provisions and military stores were already come to Le Beef, and everything preparing at that fort for making a descent on this place as soon as the Ohio is cleared of ice. A Shawnee residing near Fort Le Boeuf brought word that 40 pieces of artillery had been gathered at Fort Le Boeuf, and that report was in February. These reports were all premature, but what that tells me is that there were already rumors circulating that the French were going to mount a big buildup on the upper Ohio in the coming spring and early summer months. The problem with intelligence from native spies is this, and I think Hugh Mercer summed it up pretty well. It is much easier to relate the intelligence I receive than to reconcile the inconsistencies of it. Today we hear of a body of French being on their march against us, and perhaps tomorrow accounts will be brought that the French are running away from Venango. It is our business to prepare for the worst, and no time shall be lost in finishing the works, meaning his fort at Pittsburgh. Now here's one of the most, I think, interesting incidents of this winter, and that is, it occurred in January, February, and it involved a lieutenant in the Pennsylvania Regiment, a Lieutenant William Patterson. He, with 16 Delaware allies, traveled from Fort Augusta to Fort Michaux, snatched a French prisoner, and got away, brought the prisoner back, and the prisoner was later interrogated. This is something that you hear about the French doing all the time, but for a Pennsylvania provincial officer to do it, I think it's pretty interesting. Here's an account from on the screen you'll see an account from the Pennsylvania Gazette. It said they were immediately pursued by 70 or 80 French and Indians, but got clear off. The prisoner was expected in town. The prisoner was one Martin Woolley, captured outside of Fort Michaux. And Woolley was a French-Canadian wagoner, but he engaged in a little bit of disinformation when he was interrogated later in Philadelphia. He told the interrogator that Fort Michaux was garrisoned by 800 men, 550 of whom were from the Regiment de Lorraine. So, Regiment de Lorraine. Troops de terre at Fort Michaux, in great strength. Nothing like a little disinformation. This is, for any geographically challenged folks in the audience, this is a map that shows where Patterson and his native friends traveled. You see there about the center of the state, Shamokin is where Fort Augusta was located, so they would have gone up the west branch of the Susquehanna River. It's January, so they're probably going along the Great Shamokin Path that parallels the river. And Chinclacamoose, Clearfield, Pennsylvania, they're going to take the Venango-Chinclacamoose path that runs over the mountains to Fort Michaux. So that was their route out and their route back. And they snatched this prisoner who brought back very, very bad intelligence. So Mercer is sitting in Pittsburgh, and he's a very aggressive guy. General Amherst suggests that he should take any opportunity that he can to actually attack the French at Fort Michaux. So he issues those instructions in early March 1759. And Mercer does just that. He mounts an assault toward Fort Michaux. He sends a force of bateaux up the Allegheny River, and he marches his men overland toward the fort. And this is another account from the Pennsylvania Gazette. The 25th of March, Colonel Mercer, with 200 men, which would have been half the strength of his garrison at this point, marched from this place, Pittsburgh, for Venango, in order to remove the French from that post. At the same time, he sent Captain Clayton with 50 men in 10 bateaux with provisions and other stores to proceed up the river to join him at Venango. The 26th, it rained excessively. We can all relate to that. And raised the water so much that Captain Clayton was only 20 miles up the river, the 28th, about 10 in the morning, when he was fired on from the banks of the river, and all the men in one of the bateaux were killed or wounded. The others pushed to an island where they landed and heard whooping and firing of guns on both sides of the river. This, with the height of the waters, obliged them to return and left one bateau with 5 men. And the 30th, the bateau came floating down the river with 5 men in it, all scalped. One of them was alive when we took up the bateau and lived some hours. So Mercer made it about 45 miles up the road. That's halfway, but he was obliged to turn back. But still a very aggressive move for a guy that's, kind of hanging on by his fingernails at the forks of the Ohio at this point. Linares had a little bit more success. This is something at which French and their native allies excelled, was the raid. One of Linares' instructions, as you'll recall, was to interrupt the British communication. And here we have a map of the Forbes Road, and this was truly the Achilles heel of the post at Pittsburgh, a very, very long supply line. The fort was very dependent on constant convoys of provisions coming in. There were numerous French attacks, not just the one that I mentioned earlier on Bullitt's convoy. Here's an account, again from the Pennsylvania Gazette, of an attack, again near Fort Ligonier, where horses are taken, men killed. And Linares gives specific instructions on how to go about these raids. He tells the war parties, don't worry yourself with taking scalps or taking prisoners. That's just a waste of time. What you are to do is you're to go in, you're to kill as many draft horses as you can, you're to burn wagons, you're to burn supplies. That is their way of starving out Mercer's position at Pittsburgh. Now here's a couple of accounts. Virginian Adam Stephen, about whom we heard earlier, wrote to General Stanwix on May 25th, 1759, quote, "The enemy knows the state of the garrison and will no doubt exert their utmost endeavors to cut off the communication at this time. No convoy escorted by a number much smaller than the French have at Venango, 100 men, can be safely depended upon. The impunity with which they commit all of these outrages tends prodigiously to increase their insolences." George Crowan agreed with this assessment. George Crowan wrote, "Almost every party of ours that travels the road is attacked and beat by the enemy. The garrisons of Ligonier and Pittsburgh have not above a fortnight's provisions. If the next escort that goes up should meet with a misfortune, both them posts must be abandoned, and I assure you that 100 French and Indians would make an easy conquest here." So, Linares is hitting the British in their most vulnerable spot. But it goes beyond that. Linares' mission is going to be in the following summer to retake the forks of the Ohio. He has to have more than 100 French and native allies to do this. So over the winter, Governor Vaudreuil makes preparations for a campaign to do just that. And if we look at this map here, I'm going to just step over here a moment. We can see, okay, we can see this map is skewed a little bit. You can see Fort Duquesne here. This is the Ohio River where the artillery went after Fort Duquesne was abandoned, possibly to Fort Massiat. The French headquarters out here, Fort de Chartres, is also here. But there's a river system that the French are able to use to move fairly quickly back to the Upper Ohio Valley Theater. They can't use their usual route, which would be up the Ohio, to get to Linares. So they're going to use the Wabash River and the Maumee River, there's a portage there, into Lake Erie, and they're going to go and reinforce Linares from Lake Erie. Here's a little bit better view of that river system. Whether they're bringing the artillery back, I don't know. Artillery shows up, but whether it's the same artillery that was at Fort Duquesne is hard to say. Anyway, at the portage between the Wabash and the Maumee, French officers are given instructions to build conveyances to haul provisions and supplies and equipment across that portage. So this is going to be a very quickly but thoroughly prepared campaign. They're collecting this force. There are going to be 300 troops de la Marine from the Illinois country. That's going to be under the command of Captain Aubry, Charles Aubry, and Francois Coulon de Villiers. Now, both of these men are experienced partisan leaders on the Louisiana establishment. Aubry is 39 years old. He is an interesting guy because he served in the War of Austrian Secession as an officer of grenadiers in Europe. And after the war, he was put on half pay, so he had to find another job. He went to Louisiana as a captain in the Troupe de la Marine. He led a successful raid on, at least from the French perspective, a successful raid on the camp at Ligonier at Loyalhanna in October of 1758. He's joined by 47-year-old de Villiers, who has another 20 years of military service. He's best known for the capture of Fort Granville at Lewistown, Pennsylvania in 1756. Another 100 milice and possibly 100 natives from Detroit under the command of 55-year-old Daguenau du Ville-de-Candre are also coming to reinforce Linares' position. The biggest force is coming from Fort Niagara. Fort Niagara receives a strong reinforcement in the spring of 1759. It's unknown whether Fort Niagara is actually going to be a target or not. So Captain Michaux, this is an officer of the Regiment de Béarn, which is Michaux's regiment, is given some latitude in holding those troops at Niagara or sending them on to reinforce Linares. He decides he is safe. So on June the 1st, he detaches 800 Troupes de la Marine, milice, and Indians to go down to Fort Michaux and join Linares. They're led by two very experienced officers, Captains Repentigny and Montigny. Both of these men were born near Montreal and had worked their way up through the ranks during long years of service. And Montigny is an interesting guy. He was 35 years old at this time. He has another great name, JeanBaptiste Philippe Testard de Montigny. Okay. He probably began his service as a boy under his father at Michaux, and he learned native languages and customs. At 12 years old, he was a cadet at Fort St. Frederick, Crown Point. He participated in numerous scouts and raids on the New York, New England frontier during King George's War. He was at the Battle of the Monongahela, where he helped to salvage some of the British artillery that was left on the field. And he was second in command of the 1756 raid on Fort Bull, and it was he who personally led the attack on the gates of the fort. After the fall of Fort Frontenac in 1758, he led 600 men with their provisions to the relief of Fort Niagara. So this is a very experienced partisan warrior who is equally comfortable leading French troops or native allies. The other captain that Michaux sends is 40-year-old Pierre JeanBaptiste François Xavier Le Gardeur de Repentigny. Sorry about this. Well, Repentigny is best remembered for murdering his landlord in Quebec in 1748, and he was condemned. He had to pay a fine and be decapitated. I hope they get the order right on that. But he, because of his illustrious military service, he is reprieved. But he can't stay in Quebec because the justice system might have forgiven him, but the neighbors certainly did not. So they send him off to Cape Breton Island in 1750. And Montcalm called him a man of merit. So here you have two captains, Compagnie Franche de la Marine, who were leading the 800 men from Niagara to Fort Michaux. At first, they're going to establish a camp of observation at Presque Isle. They don't know from which direction the British are going to attack. The camp of observation could move to Niagara if necessary, or they could move down the Ohio if necessary. But they're concentrating there. By July 12th, there's about 700 soldiers and 400 native warriors in camp at Venango. And again, we're getting this information from spies that were reporting to Mercer. Mercer reported 700 French and 400 Indians. The commanding officer told them he expected 600 more Indians, that as soon as they arrived, he would come and drive us from this place. Next day, 200 Indians came to Venango, and the same number the next day and the third. They were all fitted off for the expedition by the 11th at night, and 3 pieces of cannon brought from Le Boeuf, the others expected every hour. So there's quite a buildup of troops and artillery and supplies coming down the river. It wasn't going to happen. On July 6th, the British Army landed 4 miles east of Fort Niagara, and the very next day, the fort's commandant, Captain Michaux, sent native messengers off to summon Leary to come to the fort's relief. His instructions were, quote, to fall back on Niagara with all the French and Indian troops under his command, unquote. The messenger arrived on July 12th at Fort Michaux, so it took him 5 days to get from Niagara to Michaux. That's traveling about 35 miles a day, using waterways, of course, but that's pretty respectable for 18th century travel. Native spies told George Crowan that 2 Indians arrived with a packet of letters and delivered it to the commandant, who immediately opened it and after reading talked a great deal to his officers, then spoke to the Indians and said, "Children, I have bad news for you. There is a great army of the English coming against Niagara, and with Sir William Johnson, who has with him all the 6 nations, with a great number of other Indians who live that way. I have received orders to go directly to Niagara and take you with me. We must give over our thoughts of going down this river till we have drove the English away from Niagara. You know the consequences that place is both to you and us. If the English take it, you must be poor, as it is stopping the road to your country. Children, be strong and support your father at this time. Well, the force immediately moved north. Mercer's spies told him that orders were immediately given to proceed with the artillery, provisions, etc. up French Creek. They reckon there were upwards of 1,000 Indians collected from 12 different nations. Only 3 cannons had arrived at Venango by the 12th, and 5 more were expected that night. Leary ordered his bateau, including artillery, up the river, not down as he had previously intended, and turned around those that were en route to Michaux, leaving only about 400 troops to cover the 3 forts, Presque Isle, Le Boeuf, and Fort Michaux. They set off across Lake Erie, and when they entered the Niagara River, it was said that there were so many boats filled with soldiers and native warriors that they looked like a floating island. So they arrive at the Niagara River, and one of the first things they're going to have to determine is what's the status. There's a little fort above Niagara Falls called Fort Duper Taj. It was built in 1751 to help divert some trade away from the British post at Oswego. They want to see what the status of that is, so they're going to beach their boats on Grand Island and send a scout over there. And what they find at Fort Duper Taj is that it has been destroyed and its garrison has withdrawn to Fort Niagara. They probably landed on the 22nd of July, so it takes them about 10 days to turn around, go up French Creek, go across the 15-mile portage to Presque Isle, get their boats, cross Lake Erie, enter the Niagara River, and get as far as the upper landing above Niagara Falls. The British know they're coming, so they're going to, on the 23rd of July, they're going to post some men to block the road. And I just want to talk about British dispositions here for a moment. Fort Niagara is here. The British are building siege trenches across the beach area, and they're pretty close at this point. They're about 100 yards out with an artillery battery. They're working on the half bastion that's closest to the lake, developing a pretty substantial breach there. And this is La Belle Famille. There's a big clearing, of course, around the fort. And the British are going to block the road about here. It's about a mile south of the fort. They're going to build a breastworks over here on the east side. And they're going to post light infantry troops. They send about 150 light infantry troops down there to spend the night and block the road. Now, the French are coming on about 6 o'clock in the morning, a little further south yet from La Belle Famille. The British have sent a small group of light infantry of the 60th Regiment to get a boat across the river. They want to fetch an artillery piece from the western shore and bring it back to fortify their position. While they're working on that, they're attacked by advanced elements of the French Allied natives. Many are killed, some captured, their bodies are cut up. That's why it's called Bloody Run, I suppose. But anyway, this firing is heard by the British. There's only less than a mile difference between these two positions, so they're very, very close at this point. So now, another interesting thing happens. The Six Nations warriors that were allied to the British, they've been kind of sitting things out at this point for about 10 days. They go up to the French natives right after this skirmish, and they convinced them to pull out of the action. So with one fell swoop, the French are going to lose most of their native allies. About 30 allies stay with them, but that's really a negligible force. So at this point, Leary and Aubry decide that they're going to try to bull their way through to Fort Niagara. They're marching along the road, the Portage Road, and they're going to be coming up, or going north on the road in a column. Their intelligence probably indicates that there's maybe 150 men blocking that road, because remember, the Royal American prisoners may have divulged that information. We don't know, but they may have. And this probably was influencing their thinking. We'll just push our way through and get right into the fort. Their instructions were, they had really two options. They could have come down the west bank of the river and slipped across safely into the fort after taking out the British positions on the west shore. They could have done that, but Michaux, the commandant of the fort, changed his instructions at the last minute and told them if they felt strong enough, they should try to attack one of the British posts, and the one at La Belle-Famille was the weakest. So they're going to try to bull their way through, and this is what happens in short order about 8 o'clock in the morning on July 24th. They're coming out of the woods in column. The British have now reinforced their position. They have 464 men in line blocking that road. They have grenadiers on their right flank, and they have the breastwork on the left. And as that French column comes up the road, giving a horrible yell and firing muskets from the first few ranks, the British are then able to jump up. They're lying on their bellies. They jump up. They fire many very, very crisp volleys into these tightly packed French troops. The Marine are in the front, the Milice are in the back. The French try to deploy into a line to counter this, but it's already too late. Aubry and Leary are wounded in the very first shots, the very first volleys. Leary is mortally wounded, as a matter of fact. So they lose control of the troops, and pretty soon they begin to flee. And now the Six Nations allies of the British get into the act and chase many, many of the survivors down. It's estimated that about 344 men of this force were either killed or captured in this engagement, which lasted maybe 20-25 minutes. This is an image of Sir William Johnson saving the life of a French officer, possibly Leary, and a recreation that we staged a couple of years ago of the painting. So the French force is broken. They retreat. Well, the survivors retreat back to the three forts in this area that are then destroyed, and the garrisons withdrawn to Detroit. So the question becomes, why? You have here a who's who of badass partisan warriors. The French officer corps that led this column. It's a veritable who's who of successful partisan leaders. Men that had been at Braddock's defeat in 1755, and yet they lead their troops right up the road into a meat grinder. So I've always wondered why this happened. And I think there are several reasons. For one thing, the British position was very, very well placed. The river was on one side, and on the other side was a breastwork. So you're going to funnel the French column right into interlocking fields of fire. Secondly, the British positioned themselves right inside the woods so that the ground behind them was clear. If the French did outflank them somehow, they would be doing so on open ground where they would be at a disadvantage. So their position was very, very well thought out, and it worked for them. Second, I think, reason that the French suffered this defeat, bad intelligence. This was not an ambush. You will read accounts of this, well, the French relief force was ambushed. They weren't ambushed. They knew exactly where the British were. They may not have known how strong the British were. They may have thought that there were only 150 men blocking that road. There was a school of thought in the French army that the column was a good way to attack an enemy. The shock force of a column could pierce right through the line of the enemy, break that line, and Marshal Follard was a French officer in the 1720s who was quite popular, and this idea remained popular for decades afterwards, the columnar attack. And that's certainly how this thing started off. So bad intelligence, they knew the British were there, but I think they thought they could punch their way through. They were certainly in a hurry because by this point, Michaux was in quite bad straits with a big breach being blown in the wall of the fort. So time was of the essence. A third reason, I think, I've always wondered why they didn't try to simply outflank the British position. Well, doing so would have required them to leave the road and move over through the woods where possibly the Six Nations warriors were camped. Probably not a good idea. So that option is off the table. And fourthly and finally, I think perhaps overconfidence may have been a factor as well. Neither Aubry nor Leary had lost to British forces. They had always been very successful. And they probably thought that they could just punch their way right through this force of light infantry and get into the fort. So this was really the last hope of Fort Niagara. This relief force, if you want to look at the battlefield today, this is what it looks like. There are two bars in this picture. So there is progress in the world. Two bars, and here we have a kind of a sketch of what the battle looked like with modern landmarks included. If you've ever been to Youngstown, New York, there's one red light in town. We call it the flashing red light. That's kind of the middle of where this battle took place. We just put a historic marker there last year in the right place for where the battle took place right in Youngstown. And again, this shows you how the forces were deployed and how the French retreated out of the way. So anyway, that kind of wraps it up. But the campaign from Venango to La Belle-Famille, really the last hope of the French to not only save Fort Niagara, but it really led to the downfall of all of these posts that were in northwestern Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
I was not clear. The French burnt Fort Michaux. Was it before the fall of Niagara or after the fall?
It was afterwards.
It was after.
Right. Leary had left about 400 men divided among the three forts, and the relief force, of course, there were survivors from the relief force that ran as fast as they could back to their boats, and ended up back at Presque Isle. And I believe it was early August when they just decided to abandon these three forts and retreat to Detroit. They were really untenable after the fall of Niagara. At least at Detroit, you had an agricultural population and more supplies. One thing that impressed me with this whole campaign was how much the French drew upon their western settlements to provide manpower, equipment, and provisions. It's incredible to me that they were able to muster They went from 192 men in November when they abandoned Fort Duquesne to having, possibly at one time as many as 2,500 French and Indians who were prepared to go back down the river. That's an amazing concentration of forces, but they did draw heavily on their western settlements, which had not yet been directly involved in the war. And of course, that 800 men from Niagara really helped, but in the end, that was a big mistake on Michaux's part to send those guys out. All right, thank you very much. Oh, in the back.
Was Fort Michaux still standing when Fort Venango and Fort Franklin were built, or did that come much later?
No, in fact, they sent pretty quickly after the destruction of them. They sent the English sent a couple of officers, and what they found were the charred ruins of Fort Michaux when they arrived on the scene. All right. Oh, one more.
Were the colonists, say, living outside of Philadelphia and Boston and Charleston, were they really invested in this war? Did they burn the French king in effigy? Did the women have support your troops activities?
Not that I'm aware of. They did profit pretty much from the war effort. I mean, there were a lot of military contracts being let, and in fact, one of the problems after the war ended was, you had all these merchants in New York and Boston and these seaport cities who were making a lot of money. There were a lot of jobs because of military spending, and once that stops, once peace is established and the defense budget is cut, it had some pretty dire economic consequences for these towns. But I'm not aware of anything like that. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I've never seen a reference to it. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.